I wanted to start. I mean, this question may be starting from Megan, but I think everyone feel free to chime in. One of your articles that I reread recently about the differences between education system in the Soviet Union and the United States. And you talk about the vision in the United States is a vision of school being preparing for real life. And you contrast that within the Soviet Union as school as being real life. Can you kind of talk about what does that difference mean? How do you see that, playing out today in education?
Sure. So in the early years of the revolution, thousands of schools and nurseries were created in the homes of former aristocrats. Libraries, art galleries, museums that had been open only to scholars were made public and heated to get people in the doors. So it was a system that, for all of its failings through financial, through lack of having money, um, it was about accessibility and creating democratic citizens and people who really buy into um, this project, this political project that Bolsheviks were engaged in. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in researching schools for this piece was that rather than think about schools as a place where ideological indoctrination would occur, um, Lenin and Krupskaya, who ran the programs, were very adamant. They'd read Dewey, who's a foundational American progressive educator, and they were adamant that the schools be places where that were centered around children and their needs. So they incorporated things like hands-on activities, collaborative play, self-expression, student-directed group projects. An American educator at the time who was writing a book about schools and learning around the whole entire world visited the Soviet Union, and she noticed that preschool kids weren't told what to do by their teachers. They were encouraged to come up with games on their own. So independence and collaboration. But also things like elementary schoolers there spent a year writing and producing a play, like a whole year of school, writing and producing a play around a theme that they chose. One of my favorite examples that this American teacher noticed was that instead of learning about anatomy from a textbook, the kids were encouraged to examine each other's skin before and after a run. So that's the kind of like hands-on learning that was happening in this place where there was widespread starvation, tuberculosis, all of these huge challenges that we don't have in the United States, in the wealthiest country in the world, or we shouldn't have. Our schools should be our priority. People who visited also noticed that teachers who didn't have pencils or paper for that day would just take the kids out on nature walks or go to museums. John Dewey visited pretty famously many times and went on like official visits to model schools that were created to show what Soviet schools should look like in the future. And then actual schools that were functioning on the budgets that they had. And he noticed that inside and out, children's work was taken seriously and always intended to culminate in authentic participation in life, in the democracy that they wanted, or the world that they wanted. In one model school, for example, he noticed there were some charts on the walls that went that planned changes in the community over the course of 10 years. So this group of students in this school had been coming up with challenges and solutions for their particular community from early childhood on over the course of 10 years together, which I think is pretty amazing, and not something I've ever witnessed in an American public school. Lev Vygotsky came out of all of this. He's a psychologist who's still read here and really important to me, and I think a lot of people who are teachers today. And he believed that reading and writing should be organized in a way that they are necessary for something. So the idea is like if you show kids how to read and write as a tool to shape the world around them, it becomes intrinsically motivating to them, which when I'm, raising my kids has become so apparent to me. It was apparent to me in a classroom as well as a teacher, but I think about how I engage with I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And even with my 1-year-old, I look at what he's interested in and then I kind of like build on that.
Right.
Because I know that that's what's important to him and that's how he's going to learn. And yeah, so all of these ideas are kind of supplanted in American schools, in my experience as a teacher, by a curriculum that is intended to prepare kids to be future workers, and gives them really limited control over not only what they learn and what they think about every day, but even just like their physical bodies. It's a crime the way that recess has just become something of the past. None of the schools I ever worked in New York City had functioning libraries or nurses on site, for example. So kids were pretty much confined to their desks doing paperwork. And I think the reason why I was encouraged as a teacher, and all of the teachers around me were encouraged to kind of get kids writing on paper. Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, but one is that it can be documented. So like anyone can come, any supervisor, manager can come into the classroom and evaluate you as a teacher and evaluate the students by what is there on the paper. And so that's, to me, why that has become so much more important and so much more prevalent in American schools than the hands-on activities that I described in the Soviet Union. It's just not how people learn. And I think it's really it's felt in the experiences of kids and teachers every day in schools. I mean, it's boring.
Are you telling me that not everyone just wants to code? That's what I heard we should be teaching.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the whole thing of Silicon Valley people sending their kids then to Waldorf schools where they're not even allowed to look at a computer till they're in high school.
Right. And I mean, I'm not going to name names, but a former middle school principal, and he really did believe in this vision that every kid will become a coder, and that's we weren't there yet, but we should move our school in that direction to be training the next generation of coders. It's just absurd. But to kind of circle back what I was talking before you all came on about the charter school movement, and I'm curious what you all think about this. One thing I've kind of been thinking lately is, I think during the Obama years, one strength of the charter school movement was it was seemingly bipartisan. And, I'm sure you all know that the main opponents of the Los Angeles Teachers Union, Chicago Teachers Union were Democrats. You had Arne Duncan in the Obama administration. And I think the situation has kind of changed during the Trump years where, Betsy DeVos has become such an enemy and representative of the Trump administration, and an enemy not just of the far left, but even like resistance liberals. Like DeVos is one of the Trump henchwomen that we all hate. Do you think this has affected the school privatization movement to the point where it's no longer as broad, maybe, as it used to be, or in terms of appealing in that bipartisan way? Is it more easily villainized now because of that? I'll let any of you take that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it has become more partisan. Here in West Virginia, we kind of just had an onslaught of it the last couple of years. And I was talking to some kind of national education people, and they asked, did any Democrats vote for it? And I said, no, none at all. And they were really surprised and saying, this seems to become much more of a partisan thing, a really right-wing Republican thing. We have a lot of Democrats in this state that are not real left, right? They're very conservative Democrats, but they've all opposed privatization. It seems like it's just moved over to the right. It got associated with DeVos, and that is kind of where it is now, for good or bad.
Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Well, this is Arizona, so I have many thoughts on that. But particularly here, you know, it's 100% what Jay said. It's totally partisan. The choice movement is what our governor claims, right? Arizona's number one for choice. And what that looks like, though, is we're also number one for fraud and for siphoning money. And we are the testing ground for all the new ideas. Like right now we have micro schools. So if you haven't seen micro schools yet, my own kids district here in Mesa, Arizona, tried to get a contract for over $400,000 to take money from the public school district, put it into micro schools, which are basically you get a teacher with a really small pot of kids, right? The whole pot idea. And they were running it through the district. And we actually fought back. We had over 80 public comments on it, and we actually crushed it with the Mesa Education Association, Save Our Schools Arizona, and obviously Arizona Educators United. We all joined forces, pushed back. But really, like, they just keep changing tactics and changing tactics. And here, it only comes from one party. The Democrats are totally on our side. They are pro-public education. And then the other side is the one pushing choice.
I'm in Florida right now, and I agree with that. Yesterday, the governor signed in like the largest commitment to a voucher money to private and parochial schools in the history of the state. Though I also, I think obviously that doesn't mean that we don't have to continue pushing liberals to the left on education. Like I think it remains to be seen how exactly everything's going to play out.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long this Biden honeymoon is going to last, but I'm not predicting it's going to last very long.
Yeah.
And this one, I mean, for Jay and Rebecca, I mean, you know, I was talking earlier about what it's been like teaching during COVID. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, in your respective school districts, you know, how have you all dealt with COVID-19? Like, have teachers and students been forced back into unsafe conditions? How has unions responded to this? You know, what has the experience been like?
Oh man, where to start?
Right. This is a 2-hour question, so
yeah. Oh, I mean, I'll just say everything was constantly changing. Like the metrics about whether to go back or not, when it was safe, they just kept moving the goalpost on things, which made it kind of difficult to fight. I know our unions here were just, I think they kind of thought, you know, access was power. So they were in some of the early planning meetings for the return to school, but then it turns out that no one really listened to them and they kind of just did what they wanted to do anyway. And I don't really feel like they had much of a backup plan to push back against that. We have been, in my school, we've been back in person really full time since January, which has been pretty nuts. I have my students, I also have e-learners, and sometimes I teach them at the same time, which is terrible. You know, it's not effective for them. It's not good for me. And it's been rough. We've also had, you know, various quarantine periods and we've still had in-person school since then, but we had a lot of kids have to go remote for a couple of weeks because of quarantines. It's just been a mess this year.
Ditto. I think if I were to add anything on, I don't even know where to start, but really the division that happened, right? How they divided workers was astonishing. But with putting, I mean, similar to like CTU, right? Like putting back lower grades first. So then we had the preschool teachers pitted against the upper grade teachers versus high school teachers, right? And so the division was something that, one, I didn't see coming. I should have seen it coming. And two, it really made organizing the most difficult thing on the planet, because there are some folks who were like, well, I'm safe and I'm not going to worry about my fellow worker, which was really disheartening and demoralizing, hands down, as an organizer. Some of the most demoralizing stuff we've been through. with Arizona Educators United, but the division and then not having solidarity with each other was really, really hard. It was hard. And I think we kind of played from an organizing perspective. We had to put out fires. This entire year was about up, fire, down, fire, put out fire. And that was it. There was no, and we kept pushing back, and there were some good actors and then bad actors. So we'd put all our forces into the bad actors, right? And we would try to have as much solidarity as we could down in, different districts. And at one point and then they changed the goalpost again, and then again, like Jay said. So you couldn't get a grasp on like where people were at, and then fatigue with the masks and people not listening to science, and then parent groups coming up saying, we need our kids back. I mean, it was just insane. I mean, it's just insane. I never want to go through that again.
Yeah. And I hear you on the putting out fires part. I mean, that's been one of the most frustrating things for me. I can't tell you how many times in the union we've geared up for this, something we thought was going to be this big fight, and then they wound up not bringing us back when they said they would, but it's just like constantly going from crisis to crisis. And Meg, I don't know, what about from the perspective of a parent in Florida, what has this whole process been like?
Well, I actually taught in the spring and then went on maternity leave, and it was a mess then. I am not surprised to hear that it's still a mess. I think so. Florida has actually opened the schools, and things have been kind of running mostly as normal here. My kids are 1 and 3, so it's really not. We're not public school age yet. I can't really speak to much about that knowledgeably. I do think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how we're really lucky in terms of, that whole idea of teachers' working conditions being, the same as students' learning conditions, and that's something that we can advocate around for everybody, for workers and for students. And I just kind of adding on to what everyone's saying about the divisions here were really real. Parents had real needs. I had real needs as a parent for childcare. And that also has to do with the utter lack of childcare in this country, which is pretty unique or compared to other countries around the world. But I think, and even within the workforce, like for a young teacher with not a lot of medical complications, and for a student, the risks were really different than for an older teacher. So I think all of those things were something really tough and something that we're going to have to keep thinking about and learning from.
And on the point of, the difficulty of childcare and obviously the complications that arises with parents, do you think in Arizona and West Virginia, did the union handle that well, or make any strides in terms of building alliances with parents and getting some understanding there, or was there a big division on that front?
So I'll go first, if that's okay. When you say the union, like we work in different capacities here, right? We have statewide things we do together, and then we have local things. And I think it varies by district. We had some local, in general, I think the union could have more and should have done more cohesively, more structured campaigns to push back, because we didn't see that. We had them, we saw them working on like big documents with task force and what we want to do to move the union forward for the next 10 years, which is all great and good things. But at the time we needed some serious pressure. And here it really got divided by locals. And so local by local, there were, I'm out in the East Valley suburban area, very Mormon, very right-wing, very conservative. And we had a parent coalition here working with the union, right? And I'm a parent in that local. So I helped spearhead that work because that's where my kids go. And I have 3 kids in public school right now under the age of 6. So I'm invested in that relationship, and I'm invested in getting people to use their voice. showing up at governing boards. And so we had some of that, but it was local by local. There was no cohesive because everyone was in different spots. So it's really hard to have like unity. So we formed like coalitions, like East Valley Coalition, which is a bunch of locals together, the West Valley Collaborative, which was a bunch of them pushing back on a different side of the city. So it kind of came in little pockets, but you know, I can only speak of where I was and spent most of my time organizing out here in the East Valley. And we had some parent coalitions where we would go to each other's districts and support each other, show up at governing boards, put on public comments, that kind of thing. But do I think the union could have and should have done more? Absolutely. But I realize that many leaders may not know how to lead in the moment. And that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, it was similar here. We had some locals that were doing a better job than others. Statewide, I do think our unions could have stepped up more and done more. Our caucus had really pushed some alliances with parents and even had a really good return to school plan. But I mean, you guys know you're doing union work with caucuses. It doesn't always get embraced by leadership, put it that way. And one other thing I wanted to mention that was big here, and I have a feeling, especially in Arizona and Florida, probably was too, just the political divide in the fall made this really rough. Like August and September when school is starting, I mean, you've got people who don't really even think the virus is real or it's not a big deal or something like that. And that was a real challenge early on. It actually got better as the school year went on because people saw the real problems with it and they knew people that were getting COVID. But early on, we had trouble with unity, just, you know, about the facts.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing I've been worried about even before COVID is about, you know, the growth of like cyber charters and, you know, how they're going to try to automate teaching. And I know something Jane McAlevy's said a lot is, you know, you can't offshore schools and teaching, you can't automate them. And I always just add the yet part because I think they're actively working on it. And so, you know, do you think, and this is for everyone, you know, do you think COVID-19 it has accelerated some of these trends, whether it's cyber charter, cyber schooling, the tailorization of teaching, and also thinking about surveillance and monitoring? How do you think this might play out after hopefully we get over COVID soon in education? Don't make me be a teacher and call on someone.
I mean, I hated Google Classroom before all of this, and I really hate it now. I had colleagues that would literally just like open the laptop for the day, plug all the kids into Google Classroom. They're typing away, they're working on something. The classroom is like completely silent every single day. And that was considered good teaching in that particular school. There's no behavioral issues. That's because nobody's even talking to each other. Like the kids are silent. They're working on a laptop. All the teacher is there for is monitoring that they're not like on porn sites or something. And that troubles me deeply, obviously, as a teacher. But I think this issue that you bring up, it's really, really important. And I think it's something that people are going to have to be fighting for a long time going forward. I mean, Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt, these people have all explicitly said that the project for them will be going forward to build on what they've done, which is set people up with Google. You know I have much more facility with all of the programs than I ever did because I didn't really use them, as does every teacher and as does every child. That doesn't mean that they're appropriate tools to be using in education. I mean, for me as a teacher and as a parent, the limitation, and I think a lot of parents feel this way, the limitations of the technology were just, I mean, I'd been talking about it theoretically and in the context of society and like the motivations of these corporations and student privacy, but to really feel I can't connect with my kids, they can't connect with each other. Those conversations that they have in the hallway that are super important for childhood development aren't happening. And I'm looking at their faces, and like week one, everybody's like, we're going to support you. You know, there's that feeling of like, we're together in this. It's a crisis. We're going to overcome it. But by the end of that school year, the kids were just depressed. And that's even with me. I set up chat rooms where they could hang out and talk about school related things, as I think a lot of teachers did. But it's just that lack of face-to-face connection. It sounds so cliche, but to think about like more specifically, for example, like as a teacher, I rely on being able to talk quietly to a student about a challenge that they're having with the material. There was no way to look at any kid's paper and figure it out. To just kind of look over their shoulder and have a soft conversation, not in front of everybody in the whole room. And I was teaching fifth graders who that would just humiliate them to kind of have that conversation as a whole class. And it's just, completely inefficient. So I think, all of what I'm saying is I think that there are more laptops in hands and more of the practical challenges of having people have access to devices and have knowledge of them. That's been solved, and I think will be the platform that Gates and all of the tech gurus kind of try to build on. But I think equally there will be a huge backlash among parents, teachers, and students for whom this experience was really painful. And who were robbed of so much social love all year. Which is a big part of what school is about, not just reading and writing.
Rebecca or Jay, any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, a couple things. I mean, one that I found really interesting was, at least here, the same people that were pushing us to go back in person, and they were saying virtual school is not working. It's not working. Those are also the same people that are pushing virtual education later and like literally signing those bills into law. It was just crazy. The other thought I had thinking about this, because I've used a lot of these programs obviously this year, and their entire like ecosystems, in and of themselves, like you have to have the login for this certain app or program, and everything a student does is within that. It's like I use Spotify now for music. Do I have any of that music on my own? No, it's all in Spotify. And if I'm not in Spotify, like, tough. And that's the way a lot of these apps are now. And so it's just kind of like more and more control, more and more cost, because districts have to buy access to all these different things. And it's no longer just doing a document and uploading it somewhere. It's like its own separate thing, which is scary and expensive going forward.
And kids and parents have to keep track of those passwords. Like I had colleagues who were like, my student hasn't emailed me. And I'm like, that's because they don't email. Like they don't know how to write an email. Right. They text each other.
Mm-hmm. I guess I could add maybe two things that weren't really touched upon is like, so I'm not a classroom teacher anymore. I'm actually a science specialist. I've become a digital specialist now, which is really great for organizing. PS, I know lots of things now. It's really helped my work. But so I support teachers implementing science. And I'm a Google certified teacher. And all that means is I'm really good at using the platform and clicking buttons. And I know how to do things super fast, right? But I like that sort of thing. As a science educator, there are ways that I can use it to collaborate, to talk, for productive talk discussions, to use talk moves in a Jamboard. There are really great tools that I think we're going to hold on to and we're going to keep just because kids like it. Like Jamboard. I use Jamboard all the time. But then when you get down to the other, like the app-based things, I've seen a lot of negative things. For example, Florida Virtual, since you're in Florida, let's talk about Florida Virtual for a minute. It's a terrible program. It's just terrible. And it's not even in the essence of the science standard. So I looked at the science one. It is not even It has a completely different approach than the way we're supposed to be teaching, but now districts are starting to use them not only for this year just to get by, but now we're going to have a virtual track for next year for people who still might want that. And now that's going to be 2 years worth of something that is not quality, and they purchased it, they had to buy it for 1 or 2 years, and now they're pushing it out, and that's terrifying. And also with data mining, I know you guys have seen Lois Weiner's article about data mining and privacy and all of that, and that's a whole nother bag, right? Like, how are people going to use this data, and what are they going to do with it? And I think what it comes back to for me is like, who's pushing which narrative, right? Like, I always try to pay attention to the narratives, like the learning loss narrative, which we've been trying to push back very much so and switch to asset-based thinking, relying on student strengths and cultures and values as strengths, rather than this idea that standards are not these social constructs that we have created with our best intentions for kids to learn something in a finite amount of time, which we know that's not how people learn. And so I always watch the narratives and think of, man, we got to push back, because this learning loss narrative is the one driving the ed tech tools and the ed tech programs and the apps. And that's what we need to watch. Who is really behind the learning loss narrative? Because that's going to cause some issues. But I think there are some good things about what we've learned about this year and how to collaborate online and using different tools that kids can use on an iPad or a computer, a desktop. But I do think, like, the love of learning and being in that space with one another and the connections we make is something that will never be automated. And the narrative that goes with that is what the right has been pushing. Oh, kids need to be back in school for mental health. Well, give us counselors, give us funding, give us this. Oh, they need it for, okay, lower class size. I'm with you. Let's use this narrative and let's build on it. So I think there's opportunity here also. And thinking of all of us across the nation and how we build back against narratives and use them to really get to what we need, I think there's opportunity there. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, the mental health narrative, I mean, drove me crazy. Because, I mean, we have high schools where it's like a counselor's ratio is like 400 to 1, in terms of the students. And sorry, Megan, I might have frozen.
1900 to 1, where I was teaching in West Phoenix. 1900 to 1. We shared one counselor for 2 campuses, primary, and then where I taught in the middle school, I taught in the 4th through 8th. So for our whole entire campus, 1.
It's unbelievable.
Yes, it is.
Megan, did I cut you off?
Yeah, I think my connection might have dropped. I was just saying, I think it's pushing for smaller class sizes is critical here. And I actually just read recently, so this whole learning loss thing, even by the standards of like the McKinsey people, it's only like a month or 2 of learning that they've shown through standardized testing is lost. Whereas there are studies showing that several months are gained through smaller classes. And that's not even the metric that I would use to assess a quality education. But even by their own metrics, it's really pretty a self-evidently false narrative. I also think I felt that there should be more things like having classes outside to expand recess time. And I really think that there's, I would hold education, but in a way that is child-centered and teacher-centered and affirms the values that we want to see in education, as opposed to Eric Schmidt taking everything over and telling us how to do it.
Right. And Rebecca, I'm glad you made, your first point about because I was going to say these programs, you can just see it now. They're going to be rolled out again for next year. Now that they have them, they're going to want all these new tech programs introduced. And I think this summer, professional developments are not going to be pleasant. That's what I'm predicting. They never really are, but I think it's going to be especially bad.